Melisa Idris. Welcome to The Future is Female, the show where we find the extraordinary in every woman. This is also the show where we advocate for society, policymakers and businesses to view men and women through the same lens. Now today joining me on the show we have the good folks from KRI Research Institute to talk to us a little bit about KRI's recent report titled Time to Care, Gender Inequality, Unpaid Care Work and Time Use Survey. We have Nazihah Muhamad Noor, who is a Research Associate with KRI, as well as Christopher Choong, Deputy Director of Research there. Welcome guys. Thank you. Thanks for coming on the show. Now, I'm going to start with the topic of the report. Talk to me a little bit about why the issue of care work is such an important matter to research and to document. Chris, do you want to give us a bit of a, set the scene for us a little bit?
Yeah, so the reason why we decided to look into this issue, and we actually made the argument that care is not just an important issue, which to us is an understatement, but it's actually a pressing issue for Malaysia because one is we see the kind of demographic change in the country where, it's talked about a lot in the media about the issues of aging and so on. But we are also making the case that because of the shifting expectation of care, where there's actually more demand for quality care, it's not just about quantity care, so it will continue to sort of put pressure on the system to produce sufficient number of care providers to meet the needs of society. And because of the fact that we have actually not resolved the issues of care, this actually has implications on a range of gender inequality that we still see in the labour market. So basically that, the demographic argument and also the gender inequality argument, as well as I think the fact that we exclude what we consider as the non-market, in this case, the unpaid care work, from how we think about society, how we think about policies and all that.
Definitely.
Distort a lot about how we understand the issues of welfare for both men and women.
Let's break it down a little bit. When we talk about care, what exactly are we talking about? When you looked at it in this report, how did you define it? Nazihah?
Actually, Chris.
Oh, Chris, do you wanna just kind of define it for us very quickly?
Yeah, so very quickly we look at it in terms of we include what is called the direct care and also the domestic responsibilities. So direct forms of care are like things if you feed your children, if you teach your children, or if you take care of the elderly, you give medicine to the sick. But domestic work will be things like doing laundry, household chores and all that. So we include both the direct forms of care and also the indirect forms of care in how we conceptualize what is care.
When you guys started, so you were among the, a big team looking at this as authors of this report. Was there a lot of existing literature already about this? I mean, had there been a lot of research done looking at the issue of time use, looking at the issue of unpaid care work in Malaysia, or was this one of the kind of first few pioneer reports?
I would say that there have been people who, especially internationally, actually something like looking to time use is something that is across many countries is done quite as a standard thing. Unfortunately, in the case of Malaysia, when it comes to the time use survey itself, while the Ministry of Health the Ministry of Women together with the Department of Statistics did carry out a national time use survey back in 2003, we haven't really done it since.
2003 is a really long time ago, you think about it, right?
Exactly. And it was actually used as part of the national policy making at that time. But as you said, it has been a very long time. So I think it's about time that we do this a lot more frequently.
We'll come back and talk, we'll go into detail about the time use survey. I want to kind of understand that a little bit better. But first of all, I just think this topic is so interesting because, as you mentioned, Chris, the public value of care work is not kind of taken into account. It's not given it's not quantified, given a real value. How did you guys deal with that? Because, again, we take it for granted, but it is in fact the basis of everything. Caring for a family is the basis of a good society, the basis of a productive society, and the value of care work is often missing from national accounts.
Yes.
So
definitely.
talk to me a bit about why this was important to document.
Yeah, in fact, I think this is a raging debate right now in the economic profession, where there is a lot of call to look into the definition of what value is, and this disconnect between value and price. Because if you look at things like unpaid care, where we know that it has value for society, but it doesn't have a price because it is unpaid by definition. And it is unpaid because there is no, it takes place at home amongst family members. There is no market transaction to these activities.
Sure.
So if I were to bathe my child, for example.
How much is that?
Yeah, how much is that? So
how do you put a price on that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So which is why I think from a national accounts point of view, some of the literature that we have seen on why they do not include unpaid care work in the calculations of the GDP, for example, is because there is no transaction, which is why you can't put a money value to it. But that is not to say there's no value to society.
Sure.
So I think some people call it a form of hidden subsidy to the production process or a silent partner to the production process. Because without that, productive activities cannot take place.
Exactly. That's
Yes.
very nice. Hidden subsidies. Okay, so let's talk about the report. What exactly did your research find in kind of patterns of unpaid care work? Let's start there, Nazihah.
Yeah, so I think some of the things that the report found is it speaks very much to something that we actually already know, which is that women are the ones who bear the brunt of unpaid care work more so than men.
Okay, so it kind of, I guess, confirmed what you suspected all along.
Yes,
or kind of what we all see happen in society.
Exactly,
right?
but the
Yes.
thing is, like, all this while, it has gone as anecdotal evidence.
Sure.
Whereas what we did here was to actually quantify it in terms of time. And what we did find was, as suspected, even though women and men actually spend comparable number of hours in the official workplace, but what happens is that women tend to have to also carry out the double burden, where once they go home, they start their second shift, and they do things like unpaid care work, and they do many, many more hours than men. And it's not only in terms of their primary activities, in terms of their secondary activities. So secondary activities are things that while you're cooking, you could also be taking care of your kid. So
multitasking.
Exactly.
So it's another word for multitasking.
Yes,
What women are
essentially.
famously doing all the time.
Exactly.
Okay, let me just recap this. So what you found was that men and women work the same amount of hours in paid work, so in the office or whatever salaried work that they do, but women come home and spend more time with unpaid care work. Is that accurate to say? Okay.
I mean, it's there are also more nuances to this,
Sure.
depending on how we do some of these calculations. For example, the hours that you work in the formal work, paid work, is almost similar. But once we say we deduct travel time from the calculation, so because we included travel time or commute as part of working hours, so you tend to see similar hours. But because men tend to travel more frequent and longer hours, so once we reduce that, actually women work longer hours than men.
I actually read that in the report, Chris, and I thought that was fascinating. Can we come back and elaborate on the employment-related travel hours and how that impacts, the hours that you work? Let's continue this conversation right here on The Future is Female. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Future is Female. I'm Melisa Idris. I'm chatting to Christopher Choong and Nazihah Muhamad Noor from the Khazanah Research Institute. They recently co-authored, along with the team, a report called Time to Care, which really looks at the unpaid care work, gender inequality, as well as the Time Use Survey, which was a pilot project by Khazanah Research. I want to come back to what you mentioned just before the break, Chris, about employment-related travel and how that you found that women commute less, drive less, but use public transport more. So when you factor in those hours, it means that women are actually working longer. Is that right? Okay. So tell us how this makes the double burden even more acute.
So what we wanted to understand more from the double burden is to give some spatial context to how that is experienced. So in our questionnaire, we asked questions about how you travel and the location of travel, which enable us to do that kind of geographical mapping of your time use patterns. So what we saw, one is that once we reduce travel hours from the calculation, women actually work more than men. But the other interesting observation, which tends to confirm what we see in the literature as well, is that because of unpaid care work, women tend to combine market and non-market work in different trip segments.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning to say that when they, for example, if they want to travel from point A to point B, they might want to do multiple tasks, and they combine this in that one trip segment,
Right.
as opposed to men who might, do more trip
okay.
segments and longer distances.
Wow.
So we have actually done that kind of mapping, which you can see in our report, where you can see longer lines for men and shorter lines for women, which indicate the distance traveled and the density of the travel as well. That means men are traveling more compared to women, which to us could be an indication of what we call constrained mobility for women. That means because
elaborate that, because I read that and I thought, what does that mean, constrained mobility?
Yeah, because of unpaid care work, which most of the time takes place at home. Therefore, women need to be closer to their home because of unpaid care work, which results in them maybe choosing a workplace that is closer to the house, and
Closer to schools, closer
Correct.
to childcare centers. Okay.
Yep,
Right.
yep, things like that. So
That's fascinating. I found the time use survey interesting for the fact that essentially you asked respondents to note what they did in 15-minute chunks, right? 15-minute blocks.
Yep.
And I thought about that, and I thought, how could I break my day down into 15-minute blocks if someone asked me to break it down? So tell me what you found. I mean, what was fascinating in the results of this survey for you?
I think one of the things that was quite fascinating is in terms of, because anecdotally, again, we do hear that these days men are contributing more to housework. But what tends to happen is because we're able to ask by what sort of tasks were they carrying out, what we found that in terms of men's contribution to housework, it tends to be things that are a lot more flexible.
For instance?
For instance, they tend to do things such as grocery shopping or traveling to do grocery shopping, whereas women tend to do things that are more time sensitive, things like bathing your child or cooking, things like
Which
that.
has to be done now.
Exactly, exactly. And for me, this actually can also explain things about women's work patterns. So when you talk about how, like women are maybe part of the reason why women are less likely to be working in construction work, for example, might be because they are constrained by these responsibilities that are time sensitive, because if something like construction requires them to go on site at like 9 at night, but they have to put their kids to sleep, they're not given the flexibility to do this, whereas men's tasks, things like, grocery shopping, for example, they can do at time that they can sort of be more flexible with. So I think there's a wealth of data that something like the time use survey can do, and that can address a lot of questions that we might have.
Building on that, actually, we also look at who you do the activity with. So for example, if you were to cook, do you do this together with your mother-in-law or with your spouse? So we find that actually women tend to do a lot of these activities alone, whereas men tend to do this together with somebody else, whether it is a spouse or family members or whatnot, which to us could be, again, an indication that the mental labor of doing some of this work still falls more on the women, where men might be participating, but in a more supportive way when it comes to domestic responsibilities.
Mental labor meaning that the full responsibility of having to plan, of having to think about it. That's fascinating. And again, we've kind of anecdotally seen this in our own households. How do we bring, what did you find about the men's use of time? I mean, when you look at care work, I mean, what did you find interesting about the use of men's time?
Well, I would think that on the positive side, we have actually encountered, I've personally encountered when I went down to the field, men who are actually doing unpaid care work. Okay. So all these criticisms about, for example, the paternity leave, and they say that men are not ready to take on the unpaid
that's
care.
all part of the argument against paternity
but
leave.
We have seen for ourselves real cases where men have actually been doing this, and they're happy with the decision that they have made about leaving the career and helping out in the families. Right. But the question, I think, based on the survey, is that whether this is happening at a scale that is large enough.
Right. Okay, to actually change the kind of societal mindset, right? Guys, talk to me about how we think about bringing men into the equation. How do we, I guess, shift the narrative from the care work that's only been done by women to perhaps including men to have to be part, to kind of share the double burden, so to speak. Do you want to start?
I think a lot of it will have to do with, so changing cultural and societal norms are never going to be easy. And it's not something that policy can do on its own.
Sure.
But I think it's a great start.
Oh.
Just by I think the role of policy is to actually make it easier for men if they wanted to take on more unpaid care responsibilities, they're able to. This is where things like paternity leave, for example, comes in. And because I think in terms of policies, we tend to focus too much on asking women to take up formal work. So we have hard targets like female labor force participation.
Participation, yes. I mean,
but
I've
we do
seen
have
that
an
as well.
equivalent thing about measuring men's contribution to domestic work.
Sure, yeah, that's true. I mean, we're always talking about how do we keep women in the workforce, how do we increase participation of women back to work, but how do we balance that out with what about men? How are they going to participate more in the domestic scene?
I would say even targeting men in some of the programs that we have, for example, flexible working hours.
Sure.
It's supposed to be, I mean, it's introduced as a gender-neutral type of program, but implicitly what people would understand is actually women is supposed to use the flexible working hours to go back early and take care of all these things. But what if this is targeted at men at work? That these flexible working hours is meant for men to use so that you can go back to do some of these chores.
Right.
Would that work? So I think one of it is really thinking about moving from just targeting women, but also targeting men in some of the programs. And for me, second, we can even have the kind of more softer approach, like using media, reality shows in Korea, for example.
Right, to normalize this,
Yes.
to normalize this, right? Which media and entertainment holds such a huge sway with the way society thinks about things. Can I just ask very quickly, with the double burden and what you found, is this a predominantly urban problem? Or did you find that it was both rural and urban, like all Malaysians across the board face the same problem? Nazihah, what did you think?
I think for our particular survey, because it was a pilot survey, we only looked at a specific population in Kuala Lumpur, so we weren't able to make that urban-rural comparison.
So this was targeted to how KL people live, right? So working, juggling work and care at home.
But it underscores the point that we need to have a national representative time use survey for us to understand that kind of
That's
dynamics.
true, and I wish that this was done on a regular basis, because then you could actually measure the effectiveness of policy. So for instance, if you did do the paternity leave, you could measure if men take it up and all that. Well, let's come back and continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes on The Future is Female. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Future is Female. I'm Melisa Idris. I'm speaking to Christopher Choong as well as Nazihah Muhamad Noor from KRI Research Associate about unpaid care work. Now, we were talking about the time use survey, and I hope that it's going to be done more regularly so we can kind of see how Malaysians are actually really living and the effectiveness of certain policies. But talk to me about the reaction that's come out after this report has been put out there. Have you heard from government, from businesses? What has the reaction been, Chris?
Well, I think generally it has been quite positive, but I must say that even actually before we published the report, we have actually had the chance to present our findings to different parts of government and also to some international organizations as well. So I think generally the principles of how we think about the policies and all that is acceptable because we're arguing, for example, for care to be recognized as a productive sector, for equal participation of men and women in the domestic space, as well as some attention to the issues of informal care provision.
Right.
But I think where there could be a debate is into the specifics of some of these recommendations, like whether it is paternity leave or whether it is what kind of allowances or investments that we want to, introduce.
I think it's quite interesting. Just reading some of the recent reports, right? So I read recently that the Malaysian Employers Federation, they said that the lack of government incentives is one of the reasons why the private sector is dragging its feet in terms of setting up childcare centres in the workplace. There's also that entire conversation happening around paternity leave, about whether businesses can afford to provide 7 days of paternity leave for fathers. How do we get businesses involved in this conversation? It's not just government and public policy, but businesses to get on board and say, well, you are part of the problem and part of the solution in trying to shift the gender gap or the gender imbalances when it comes to care work. Nazihah, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think definitely businesses have a huge part to play. I think maybe though, right now we're focusing so much on the cost of having these things like paternity leave, having childcare at the workplace. But I would also argue that we haven't then looked into so much what are the costs of not having these things. So if you like not having paternity leave, for example, or generous enough a maternity leave, it has been found internationally that it has effects on employee retention rate, for example. So whereas in companies like Google, YouTube,
The big tech companies, right?
Exactly. If they have generous enough parental leave policies, they actually find that they save a lot on just reducing the cost of having to retrain new employees, etc. So I think this is something that we can discuss more.
Do you think that that argument will fly with businesses? You know, it's really difficult. You know, at the end of the day, they're going to look at cost, they're going to look at return on investment, aren't they?
Right.
I mean, if you look at it, whether the employers provide, for example, paternity leave or not, this work has to be done by somebody. So before this is the cost is fully borne by the households or the families. So the question now is whether employers want to come in to share in part of this cost or not, as we shift our economic structure to one where we want to encourage a dual earner family. That means we want men and women to work.
Sure.
So in the past, okay, if you have a male breadwinner model type of family where the men work and the women do the hidden subsidy part.
Yes.
But the question now is we want women to also join the workforce. So who is going to provide the hidden subsidy here for society?
Right.
So which is why I think the impetus is there to pressure companies to also play a part in taking a collective share.
Sure, yeah, a collective responsibility as well. Something just occurred to me, and I'm sure many households watching have help, right? So have external help, domestic help, part-time or live-in. Did that factor into care work that in your research, Chris and Nazihah?
Actually, when we looked into it, we found that the number of households that have live-in domestic maid is actually, I think they make about 2% of all households in Malaysia.
So actually, when you think about it, you don't have a lot of households with domestic helpers.
Foreign domestic workers.
Yeah.
Okay.
So our estimation, which is quite conservative, is about 2%.
And even based on studies from the National Family Board, they have found that in terms of childcare more specifically, most families rely on grandparents to take care of their children. I think it's about 34% or 28% of families actually rely on grandparents. But then we also have to think about what is the cost for these grandparents who are taking care, who are now...
There's always a cost,
Exactly.
right?
This is exactly the thing. Somebody has to bear the cost. So it's the question of, is it time for businesses to also share part of their profit and to fund some of these things?
Interesting. Okay, Chris, what are you really hoping for in terms of a conversation with policymakers in putting this report out? What are you most hopeful to see in the near future?
Well, we are actually calling for a coherent set of family benefits, because the way we think about some of these things right now is that, okay, I have a program that deals with childcare, one that deals with elderly care. We have iSuri, which deals with recognition of housewives, and then
it's kind of fragmented all over the place, right?
Yeah, but actually, like when you talk about children, elderly, and all that, they all could be part of a single family.
Sure.
So the question is, can we have a coherent way of structuring our incentives? Like, for example, childcare allowance and parental leave in other countries. We have looked at Finland, Netherlands, Singapore. The parental leave will kick in after the end of the childcare allowance will kick in after the end of the parental leave. So there's some kind of thinking which is along a life cycle, as opposed to, now one is handled by the Ministry of Labour, Human Resources, and another one that's handled by the Ministry of Women.
Okay.
So I'm
looking at it for a more holistic, cohesive manner, which is probably better for people and will I guess, benefit. You get the full benefits of these incentives, right? Nazihah, in the last minute or so that we have left, what message would you like people watching in this report? I mean, I think a lot of people are saying, well, that's confirmed a lot of what I've suspected all along. I am also, I've seen this in my household. I suffer from the double burden, have to carry the double burden. What do you want this report to contribute to the conversation about unpaid care work?
I think from this report we can see that it's no longer just anecdotes. We have the data to back it up. now it's
Well,
time
thank
for
you
us to
for
do
that.
something about it.
Okay, and now
Yeah.
you want the conversation to change, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think it's high time that we start focusing our policies not just in terms of asking women to participate in formal employment, but we should also start asking our men to step up, essentially.
All right, there you go, men. That's a message out for you. Step up and contribute to the unpaid care work at home. Okay, thank you so much for speaking with me, guys. It's been such a pleasure. That's all the time we have for this episode of The Future is Female. I will be back with you same time next week. I'm Melisa Idris signing off. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.